The world watched in 2011 as Libya erupted. Muammar Gaddafi, the country's longtime leader, was overthrown after 42 years in power. His demise was brutal, his final days filled with chaos and violence. The images were stark: a dictator fallen, a nation in turmoil. The catalyst for this dramatic shift was a civil war, one that drew international attention and intervention. A coalition of forces, led by the United States and NATO, entered the fray. Their stated goal to protect Libyan civilians caught in the crossfire. Gaddafi's rule was undeniably autocratic. He brooked no dissent, silencing opposition with an iron fist. The uprising against him, part of the larger Arab Spring, was met with swift and brutal force. Civilians were targeted, cities besieged. The international community felt compelled to act. The intervention in Libya was presented as a necessary measure, a response to a dictator's tyranny. But even as bombs fell and Gaddafi's regime crumbled, questions lingered about the true motivations behind the intervention. The intervention in Libya was about saving lives, preventing a massacre, and protecting civilians. The conflict was escalating, and civilians were bearing the brunt of the violence. The international community had a responsibility to act. But was military intervention truly the only option? Gaddafi's regime, despite its authoritarian nature, had maintained stability in Libya for decades. The decision to intervene militarily is not one to be taken lightly. It is an act of war, with the possibility of unintended consequences. The speed and scale of the intervention raised eyebrows. Within weeks, NATO forces were bombing Libyan targets. A no-fly zone quickly morphed into a full-blown bombing campaign. The stated goal may have been to protect civilians, but the reality suggested a different objective: regime change. This ambiguity paved the way for a military intervention that ultimately led to the toppling of Gaddafi and the descent of Libya into chaos. To understand the events of 2011, we must look beyond the surface. The official narrative is incomplete. It fails to account for the complex web of geopolitical interests and economic considerations. The fall of Gaddafi was not simply a victory for democracy and human rights. It was a seismic event with far-reaching consequences. Gaddafi was a dictator who ruled Libya with an iron fist, but he was also a fiercely independent leader who refused to bend to Western powers. He nationalized Libya's oil industry, using the wealth to fund social programs. He challenged the dominance of the US dollar, advocating for a pan-African currency backed by gold. These actions threatened the established global order. Libya's strategic importance, with its vast oil reserves, made it a coveted prize. The intervention in Libya was part of a larger geopolitical game, where control of resources and strategic positioning were paramount. As the Arab Spring reached Libya, all eyes turned to Muammar Gaddafi. Having ruled for over 4 decades, Gaddafi was a master of survival. But the wave of protests in 2011 posed a unique challenge. Unlike other autocrats, Gaddafi showed no willingness to compromise. He dismissed protesters as foreign agents and drug addicts. He vowed to crush the rebellion, unleashing his security forces on civilians. Gaddafi's brutal response shocked the world. The situation in Libya escalated rapidly, teetering on the brink of civil war. Gaddafi delivered fiery speeches, vowing to fight to the death. The international community condemned Gaddafi's actions. Sanctions were imposed, assets frozen, and travel bans put in place. Despite the mounting pressure, Gaddafi remained defiant. As the conflict in Libya raged on, a humanitarian crisis unfolded. Civilians bore the brunt of the violence. Cities came under siege, with food, water, and medical supplies dwindling. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and thousands were displaced. The world watched in horror as the situation spiraled out of control. International organizations issued desperate pleas for a ceasefire. The United Nations estimated that hundreds of thousands needed urgent assistance. Aid agencies struggled to access conflict zones. The images coming out of Libya were heartbreaking. The international community grappled with how to respond. Some argued for immediate military intervention. Others urged caution, fearing that intervention could exacerbate the violence. Muammar Gaddafi relished his role as a thorn in the side of the West. He railed against their neo-colonial ambitions. Beneath the surface lay a deep-seated resentment of Western dominance. Gaddafi believed Africa had been systematically exploited by the West. At the heart of Gaddafi's defiance was a plan to challenge the US dollar's hegemony. The dollar's dominance gave the United States immense power. Gaddafi saw this as economic colonialism. His plan centered on nationalizing Libya's oil industry and creating a pan-African currency backed by gold. By controlling its own oil wealth, Gaddafi argued, Africa could chart its own economic destiny. The idea of a pan-African currency threatened the West. Gaddafi's economic defiance was inseparable from his broader political vision, the creation of a United States of Africa. He envisioned a continent united under a single government, a single military, and a single currency. This, he believed, was the only way for Africa to achieve true independence. Gaddafi's vision resonated with many across Africa, particularly among those who longed for an end to division, poverty, and conflict. They saw in Gaddafi a leader who was willing to challenge the status quo and fight for Africa's rightful place in the world. Gaddafi's economic and political ambitions, while admirable to some, ultimately proved to be his undoing. His defiance of the West, his challenge to the dollar's dominance, and his vision of a united Africa made him a target. The narrative of Gaddafi as a brutal dictator served as a convenient pretext for intervention. His crackdown on the Libyan uprising provided the West with the moral justification it needed to act. The West had long turned a blind eye to Gaddafi's abuses, often courting him as an ally and a business partner. The intervention quickly morphed into a full-blown regime change operation, culminating in Gaddafi's brutal death. Beneath Libya's scorching sands lies a treasure trove of high-quality crude oil. This natural bounty has fueled economic growth and elevated Libya's strategic importance. Yet it has also been a source of contention and foreign interference. Libya's oil reserves are the largest in Africa, estimated at over 48 billion barrels. Its low sulfur content makes it easier and cheaper to refine, attracting global energy players. For decades, international oil companies have flocked to Libya, eager to tap into its lucrative energy sector. The discovery of oil in the 1950s transformed Libya into a major oil exporter. The 1969 coup brought Muammar Gaddafi to power, marking a turning point in Libya's oil industry. Gaddafi nationalized the oil industry, expelling foreign companies and asserting state control. Gaddafi's nationalization of the Libyan oil industry was a watershed moment for Libya and Africa. It was a bold assertion of sovereignty, inspiring other nations to demand a greater share of profits. Libya experienced unprecedented economic growth, investing in infrastructure and social programs. However, it also concentrated power, fueling corruption and cronyism. The lack of transparency raised concerns about revenue management. Western powers viewed nationalization as a threat to their energy security. This tension eventually led to the 2011 intervention. Gaddafi's control over Libya's oil gave him leverage in international affairs. He manipulated output to influence global oil prices. Gaddafi demanded better terms from oil companies, frustrating Western governments. His unpredictable behavior made him a thorn in the side of Western powers. He forged alliances with countries hostile to the West, using oil revenue to support liberation movements. This strained relations with the West, fueling suspicions about his motives. Gaddafi's plan for a pan-African currency threatened Western economic interests. The prospect of a rival currency alarmed Western policymakers. The West's dependence on Libyan oil created a volatile dynamic. It fostered a sense of vulnerability in Western capitals. This tension created fertile ground for intervention in 2011. The 2011 intervention in Libya, while presented as a humanitarian mission, unfolded against a backdrop of geopolitical maneuvering. Western powers aimed to secure access to Libya's oil wealth. They saw an opportunity to reshape the country's political landscape. The swiftness and scale of the military campaign pointed to objectives beyond civilian protection. The intervention was a scramble for spoils. Western interests were prioritized in post-Gaddafi Libya. Western oil companies quickly returned, reclaiming their stake. However, Libya descended into chaos, with rival militias and extremist groups exploiting the power vacuum. The stage was set for intervention in Libya. Gaddafi's brutal crackdown and the escalating humanitarian crisis created a pretext for Western powers to act. On March 17, 2011, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1973. This resolution became the legal basis for a military intervention. Operation Odyssey Dawn was launched on March 19, 2011. The primary objective was to enforce a no-fly zone over Libya. However, the scale and intensity of the air campaign raised questions about the West's true intentions. NATO forces were bombing not just Libyan air defenses, but also government buildings and infrastructure. The no-fly zone quickly morphed into a tool for regime change. The intervention's goal of protecting civilians became difficult to reconcile with the military campaign. NATO's actions revealed an agenda beyond humanitarian concerns. Targeting Gaddafi's inner circle, command centers, and infrastructure pointed to a strategy of regime change. Western rhetoric shifted from protecting civilians to removing Gaddafi. The line between civilian protection and regime change blurred. The intervention expanded to include Gaddafi's removal. The humanitarian crisis served as a pretext for strategic interests, including access to Libya's oil. It sent a message to other autocrats about defying the West. The intervention highlighted double standards and fueled resentment as a form of neo-colonialism. War, by its very nature, is a messy and unpredictable affair. Despite the best intentions, civilian casualties are inevitable. The intervention in Libya was no exception. NATO officials claimed precautions, but the reality was chaotic and devastating. The fog of war made it difficult to establish a definitive civilian death toll. Independent estimates suggest thousands of Libyan civilians were killed. Vital infrastructure was destroyed, causing widespread suffering. The intervention's unintended consequences extended far beyond immediate destruction. The toppling of Gaddafi's regime created a power vacuum, plunging Libya into chaos. Rival militias vied for control, turning Libya into a battleground. The collapse of law and order in Libya had a spillover effect on the region. Weapons from Gaddafi's arsenals fueled conflicts in neighboring countries. Libya became a haven for extremist groups, including ISIS. The flow of migrants and refugees surged, risking their lives to reach Europe. The intervention had far-reaching and unintended consequences. It highlighted the complexities and dilemmas of intervention in the 21st century. It served as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the unintended consequences of interventions. Libya became a microcosm of the broader regional turmoil engulfing the Middle East and North Africa. Once a relatively homogeneous society under Gaddafi, Libya fractured along tribal, regional, and ideological lines. The old order was swept away, leaving a void filled by violence and fragmentation. Militias, initially united against Gaddafi, turned on each other, vying for control. Tribal allegiances resurfaced, fueling cycles of revenge and retribution. The eastern region, rich in oil, sought greater autonomy, deepening divisions. Two rival governments emerged, each claiming legitimacy and control. The fractured state of Libya had devastating consequences for its people. The chaos unleashed by the intervention in Libya had far-reaching consequences, extending well beyond the country's borders. The collapse of law and order created a security vacuum quickly exploited by criminal networks and extremist groups. Libya became a hub for human trafficking, arms smuggling, and illicit trade, destabilizing the entire Sahel region. The proliferation of weapons fueled conflicts and instability in neighboring Mali, Niger, and Chad. Extremist groups, including Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram, took advantage of the lawlessness to establish safe havens and training camps. The intervention in Libya also had unintended consequences for Europe. Libya became a major transit point for refugees and migrants desperate to escape violence and poverty. The flow of migrants surged, overwhelming European countries and fueling a political crisis. The rise of ISIS in Libya was perhaps the most alarming consequence of the intervention. The terrorist group established a foothold in Sirte, exploiting the power vacuum and absence of a functioning central government. From its Libyan base, ISIS launched attacks on neighboring countries and plotted terrorist attacks in Europe. While ISIS has since been driven from Sirte, its ideology and ability to exploit instability continue to pose a threat. The intervention in Libya, sold as a humanitarian mission, exacerbated the very problems it sought to solve. It unleashed chaos, violence, and instability, fueling terrorism, human trafficking, and a refugee crisis that continues to challenge Europe. The legacy of intervention is a stark reminder of the unintended consequences of military action and the perils of regime change without a viable plan for peace and reconstruction.